actually makes a conversation work or fail for people with hearing difficulties is a topic that we're going to cover in today's Eriksholm Update, so welcome. In this episode, we're going to explore how research is studying real conversational dynamics, listening effort, and real-world listening engagement, and including situations where communication difficulties are not explained by the audiogram alone. Hearing difficulties don't just impact the person with a hearing loss, they also significantly impact the person that somebody might be having a conversation with. So how do we go about really trying to understand natural conversation dynamics in a way that we can better support a hearing impaired user and their conversational partners with the hearing aids that we will provide them? Now, our next guest is Josefine Munch Sørensen. She's a scientist at Eriksholm, and she's an expert in communication science and is specifically looking at a phenomenon known as turn-taking. Welcome, Josefine.
Thank you.
So we have extremely good metrics for understanding speech. And by that I mean, we can go from a phoneme level all the way through to intelligibility in various different speech tests. But how do we even begin to go about looking at, trying to understand naturalistic conversation?
We actually do that by looking at the heart of communication, which is conversational turn-taking. So when you have a conversation with someone, you're in this coordinated dance with them, taking turns in a very systematic way. And the timing of these turns matters, because even small delays and when you take a turn can completely change how you're interpreting what someone is saying.
Yeah.
So, for example, if I wait more than half a second before I reply, you might actually perceive that as hesitation or even disagreement. And to time your turns at socially appropriate times, you actually need access to many subtle conversational cues.
So maybe could you give us some examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So when you speak, you are changing your level of your voice and the intonation of your voice, and you actually also change the way that you're breathing. And all of these things are a small cue for your conversational partner that now I'm about to finish my turn and it's your turn to speak.
Right.
And for a person who has a hearing loss, many of these cues actually become harder to pick up. And when they're harder to pick up, it's also harder for them to maintain this conversational flow. So what's exciting is that we can actually measure this, because we can see that people who have a hearing loss, they take turns later and with more variability. And that actually creates more friction in the conversation.
So maybe could you share a recent insight from the work that you've done so far?
Yeah, so what we are uncovering at the moment is that having a hearing difficulty don't just affect you, but it also affects your conversational partner. What we can see is that, especially in high noise levels, the normal hearing partner in a conversation is actually experiencing more conversational breakdowns than their hearing impaired partner, especially when the hearing impaired is wearing their hearing aid. Now that might sound surprising, but the reason seems to be that they're changing the way that they speak in a way that is unintentionally unhelpful for their normal hearing partner, by, for example, speaking too softly.
Yeah.
So now the normal hearing partner has to work harder to maintain the conversational flow. And actually they report this in questionnaires because they say to us that they actually experience that they are struggling more.
I mean, somehow the results of this work are profound.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, and please don't take this wrong, is somehow obvious.
It is obvious, yeah, exactly.
And I guess it's just the fact that we now have the data that can legitimately back this up, that we can start making claims along those lines.
Yeah, exactly. That we can actually systematically see how it's impacting the conversation and what's the functional units that adds to this. And one of the recent things that we also saw was that people who were able to synchronize their pitch more closely were also able to take turns more precisely. That's quite exciting, because we know that this subtle mirroring of each other's behavior is something that helps build rapport and also strengthen the feeling of connection between people. So the more you have access to each other's cues, the more you can tune in on each other's cues, the better you can stay in this conversational dance and the more connected you feel.
Yeah.
So that is really emphasizing that communication is this shared effort between people, and it also opens up opportunities for hearing aid technology that doesn't just support the person who has the hearing loss, but actually supports the whole dynamic of the conversation.
Yeah, and supports the positive connection that they will have with their conversational partners.
Exactly.
So I guess this work, I mean, I can really see how this work could lead to insights that can help us build, the bedding hearing aids of the future, which is fantastic.
Yeah, we hope so.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Effortful listening in communication is driven by the listening conditions or the acoustics of the situation, but also the motivation of the person in having that communication situation. Now, to study communication difficulty, we really want to have a measure, a metric of engagement, or the willingness for an individual to exert mental effort to actually understand what's going on. Now, I've actually had the pleasure of interviewing one of the PhD students working with Eriksholm, Kathrine Lowes. She is working with this listening engagement and specifically working on a measure known as interpersonal synchrony. Welcome, Kathrine. Thank you very, very much for taking the time to take this interview. Please explain to us what is interpersonal synchrony and what is the goal of your project.
Yeah, you might have noticed that when you spend time with someone, you start speaking at a similar pace or mirror their gestures and even maybe align your body language. And this is all a result of processes of interpersonal synchrony. So it's overall an alignment of behavior and physiological signals, such as brain activity, heart rate, and respiration. And this alignment appears to play an important role in social interaction, and it's also been suggested to reflect attention and engagement. So essentially the goal of my research is to see whether interpersonal synchrony can be this reliable and objective marker of listening engagement, both in passive listening situations, but also in conversations.
Okay, so then practically speaking, how do you go about measuring that?
So there are many different approaches to measuring interpersonal synchrony, but one that I'm particularly interested in my project is called intersubject correlation. And essentially, this method looks at how correlated or similar people's responses are when they're experiencing the same situation. So if everyone's responses change in similar patterns, we can say that there's high interpersonal synchrony. And it's been suggested to be this marker of engagement and attention, both when people are interacting face-to-face, but also when they're simply focusing on the same stimulus, such as when you're watching a movie together with someone else. So basically, when our heart rate and brainwaves sync up with others, it's a sign that we're engaged and attentive and sharing a moment.
Super. So then the next kind of phase of this is you starting to look at then the impact of hearing impairment. What are your thoughts about that?
So my work sort of explores whether this measure of intersubject correlation can be used also in challenging listening situations, because we know that people with hearing loss might disengage when listening becomes too effortful, and currently we have no objective way of measuring when that happens. So I'm very curious to see if that works.
Yeah, I mean, which makes a lot of sense, of course. So far in your PhD, you're kind of focusing more, or you have focused more on sort of more controlled listening situations, and then kind of the next phase then is to be basically a little bit more real life, to try and get into some more dynamic situations to reflect, hearing impaired experiences in the real world. How are you going to go about that?
So we have set up a conversation study to investigate these more dynamic settings that are closer to the real world than a passive listening situation. And in this conversation study, we collect multiple types of data, like acoustic data, behavioral responses, but also still physiological data. And the goal is then to see whether intersubject correlation can still capture engagement in these more complex and interactive settings.
So I guess, the minute you're giving up this experimental control that you would have had in the classic approaches, it's bringing in all sorts of additional challenges for you to understand and interpret that data. So how is that impacting the methods that you've been developing?
So that will, of course, impact the methods, and introducing this dynamic conversation scenario introduces many new challenges. Of course, conversations are dynamic and can become asymmetric when you converse with a person with hearing loss, for instance. So in these cases, responses may not happen at the same time for both people. There may be shifts or delays, indicating how people adapt to one another. I'm particularly interested in if we can capture this shift from when it goes from being a mutually engaging interaction to one where one person starts to struggle and then might take on more of a dominant leading role, and then the other one adapts. So it would be interesting if we can adapt and explore new methods that can capture this dynamic as well.
So then the overall goal is to then develop this objective measures of engagement, but now in situations that really resemble everyday life. Is that the idea?
Yeah, that is the overall idea. Exactly.
Super. Thank you very, very much for your time, Kathrine. Around 5 to 10% of people who complain of hearing difficulties seek help at a hearing clinic for the challenges that they're facing in their daily lives, probably with speech and noise and communication. But they're essentially told at that point that they have normal hearing, at least as measured by an audiogram, and then they are sent home with absolutely no support or help. And obviously this is a well-known challenge, and this is a particular problem that we're trying to address with the so-called Uptreat project at Eriksholm. So I'd like to introduce Jonathan Regev. He's one of our scientists working on the Uptreat project, trying to look into this, what we call underserved population. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you, James.
So in your opinion, why is it difficult at the moment to provide clear guidance or clinical support for this group?
So the main challenge we currently experience in clinical practice is that it all revolves really around the audiogram, which is actually just a measure of audibility loss. And that means that when a patient presents with substantial hearing difficulties but no audibility loss to be measured, then there's nothing in a clinician's handbook and nothing in the guidelines for how to provide any help.
Yeah.
And there are no guidelines for how a hearing aid could provide support to those people.
Yeah. So what is the state of evidence then for using hearing aids with this group of people?
So there are a number of studies that have emerged in the past few years. It's relatively mixed and exploratory. Most of the studies that exist have focused on subjective ratings as the outcome, which makes sense because that's the main pain point people present with. And it suggests that hearing aids can actually provide relief from a subjective point of view. The difficulty we're still facing is that we're lacking strong objective evidence that the hearing aids actually help with intelligibility. And importantly, we also don't know what the underlying mechanisms of the hearing difficulties are. So if we don't know what the source of the problem is, it's a bit difficult to tackle it.
So we don't know the why, and then we there's a mixed bag of evidence on the hearing intervention at this point.
Exactly.
Okay, so then how are you going to tackle this problem in the Uptreat project then?
So we have 3 lines of investigation. The first one is similar to what's already been done. So it's looking at hearing aid intervention, but it's going beyond factors that only look at amplification.
Right.
It's looking at the individual needs of the participants, in that we're looking at real world data coming from ecological momentary assessments, or EMAs, to try to understand in which cases they're really struggling.
Right.
We're trying also to quantify the effect of the hearing aid intervention with objective measures such as speech intelligibility, but also listening effort.
Okay, so then what are the other methods that you're using in this?
So we have 2 other lines of investigations that focus less on the hearing aid intervention and more on the underlying mechanisms. And one of them is really focusing on behavior.
Yeah.
It's looking at auditory cognitive profiling. Right. The idea there is to try to build an understanding for how people perceive sound and perceive the world around them, because we have an idea that that's what essentially underlies the difficulties they're facing.
Yeah.
We are expecting that we can split this population into subgroups that each have a very specific auditory cognitive profile.
Right.
And we're looking at tests that go beyond the audiogram. A good example is the Audible Contrast Threshold Test, or ACT, that might provide us a lot of information, and that is easily implementable in clinics.
Yeah. And then the third line of investigation will be?
That's very similar to the one looking at behavior, but it's actually looking at electrophysiology, or how the brain processes the sounds.
Yeah.
The idea there is to build an understanding for individual differences that underlie the hearing difficulties in the neural processing along the auditory pathway.
Yeah.
And what we're hoping to do there is to use those information as markers for the benefit of the hearing aid intervention, if there is one, to see if we can actually predict the success of the hearing aid intervention based on those markers.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what we'd like to do, of course, is connect all 3 lines of the project so that we build a really complete picture of this population.
Yeah, so exactly that. So you're by combining behavioral, by combining real world data, and by combining this kind of neural profiling, hopefully you're able to better describe who is going to benefit from getting a hearing intervention and or not.
That's exactly right.
Excellent. Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for watching this episode of the Eriksholm Update. As always, if you have any topics that you would like to hear more of, please reach out. See you next time.